Okay, the PowerPoint that I prepared hasn't saved some of the pictures, so this is a slightly older one that might not correspond entirely. I don't want you to think that I'm one of those academics that rocks up with a really old PowerPoint and just wings it. I have really prepared, but this will generally correspond to the paper. So, I'm China Mills. I'm a lecturer at Sheffield University. And I just want to start really by saying thank you for welcoming me into this space. This area of work is new in some ways to me, and I've certainly got a lot to learn from all of you, from the people in this room. So I come to this from working for a number of years in India, and particularly researching the impacts of what's called the movement for global mental health. And in India, as you probably are very aware, and as Scott has just touched upon, hundreds of thousands of rural farmers have died by suicide, very much linked to agricultural and economic reforms. And so the response from the movement for global mental health, and we can perhaps talk about this in the discussion if you want to, as well as from the Indian government, despite some acknowledgement that this is to do with bigger agricultural reform and debt, etc., has generally been to send out teams of psychiatrists to speak with rural farmers and to call for increasing accessibility to antidepressants in rural areas. But today I'm going to talk about something slightly different from that, and I'm going to talk about suicides that are associated with welfare reform, or what have come to be thought of as austerity suicides in a UK setting. Though my feeling is this may be applicable in certain ways to lots of countries that have experienced austerity, but I am just talking about the UK in this particular talk. So I'm not going to go into any details of the deaths, and all the information that is on here is information that's very much publicly available online. I'm particularly focusing on newspaper articles. But obviously it's extremely distressing, and it's actually just really heartbreaking work to be doing. So let me begin. One of the symptoms then of post-financial crisis austerity in the UK has been an increase in the number of suicides, especially by people who have experienced welfare reform. So on the 30th of March 2017, during a meeting in the UK Parliament about cuts to welfare payments, or what we call benefits often in the UK, and benefit sanctions, a minute's silence was held to remember all those who died as a result of the welfare cuts and austerity measures that have become part of the UK policy landscape since 2007-2008. So disabled activists, including those from Disabled People Against Cuts, or DPAC, held a banner outside Parliament that said, "Dead people don't claim." 1 minute's silence is not long enough to remember all of these deaths, and particularly the suicides that have been linked to austerity measures. So it's been estimated from the Department of Work and Pensions mortality statistics, however much they have tried to cover them up, that on average about 80 people per month have died and are dying in the UK after just being found fit to work, so after undergoing a medical assessment essentially which says that no, they can work and they're not eligible for benefits. This is what I mean about, there we go. And over the period of 2010 to 2013, the work capability assessment process has been associated with what's considered to be an additional 590 suicides, doing these kind of aggregate analysis. So disabled people's activism and disabled people's groups have been central to bringing austerity suicide to public attention. And the Black Triangle campaign and Callum's List, for example, maintain websites that list newspaper coverage and freedom of information requests, etc., about these deaths have been so central to this. And in fact, austerity suicide has become so normalised within the welfare system in the UK that it was mentioned in the 2015 elections and in the general election that we've just had. And this normalisation perhaps became most starkly apparent in a recent tweet from someone's experience of being assessed for eligibility for a particular kind of welfare, the personal independent payments. And that's carried out by a private company, Maximus, who do the work capability assessments for the Department for Work and Pensions, the DWP. And this person says that they were asked in this assessment process, "Can you tell me why you haven't killed yourself yet?" So, and Twitter actually has been a site of so much of activism, if you like, around exposing and kind of bringing to public attention the concept or the act of austerity suicide. So compared to numbers of deaths, suicides linked to welfare reform have received quite scant newspaper coverage and not too much scholarly attention. So the point of departure for this paper here is to explore how welfare reform suicides are reported in the scant coverage, and if the ways that they are reported can help us to perhaps understand why they're not reported more widely, if it's kind of limiting how we understand these kinds of suicides. And so this talk is based on a longer paper which has just been accepted in Critical Social Policy, and which I can share with any of you who would be interested when it's published, which tries to utilise an analytical framework of psychopolitical autopsy, which I'll talk about in a minute, to trace suicide as one of the symptoms of austerity and welfare reform. Who knows what? Okay, yeah. So by psychopolitical, I'm trying to attend to the need to take seriously the psychic life of austerity. So, for example, internalisation of shame, abjection, anxiety, worry, and embed that psychic distress in a context of social dis-ease. So this analysis takes Vicky Reynolds, for example, seriously when she says we need to structure into our analysis of a person's death the context of social injustice in which they lived. This approach widens analytic framing of suicide from this solely individual focus that we've heard about earlier this morning, and to move from psychocentric mobilisations of mental health to take seriously austerity's nervous conditions and the internalisation of eugenic and market logic, as well as to illuminate culpability of government reforms while still retaining the complexity of suicide. So we might try to think about how so-called welfare practices can kill people and can come to feel like murder, as Stevenson talks about. So to better understand us, doing this and to help us in this kind of psychopolitical analysis, to understand how austerity kills people, this paper draws upon the psychopolitical work of the anti-colonial revolutionary Frantz Fanon. So not only does Fanon provide us with a language for tracing the psychological impact of colonialism, which is the context in which he was writing and working, but also for tracing how the psi disciplines, psychiatry, psychology, etc., reconfigure the impact of austerity and economic crisis and turn it into or re-articulate it as individual crisis. So enabling, as Lauren Ballant talks about, political crises to be cast as conditions of specific bodies, and then diverting potentially public discussion of government culpability in favour of more sort of individual psychological level factors. So for this particular paper then, I focused on newspaper articles about suicides that are archived online through Callum's List, which I think I've got, through Callum's List and the Black Triangle campaign. So what I found quite interesting then is that a lot of the same newspapers that demonise welfare claimants, and we'll talk about this in a minute, kind of create this culture of stigmatisation of claiming welfare, also quite often sympathetically and quite heartbreakingly depict austerity suicides. So the sort of key findings, if you like, from this sort of the early findings from this work, which I'm going to tell you now in case I run out of time, are that newspaper coverage tends to report individual cases of suicide, very sympathetically, I would say, quite contextually to some extent, but without usually making links to wider patterns of death. So it's always an individual story of their encounter with the benefit system. It doesn't then say this person is one of 2,200 who, they're not making those links. So secondly, that the mobilisation of mental health problems in some of the newspaper coverage works to configure suicide as being an outcome of mental illness, even when mental illness is acknowledged to be linked to austerity. So the sort of social factors come in there somehow. A wider stigmatisation of welfare claimants and sort of dependency, I would say more broadly, as a key element of the psychic life of austerity. And also disabled people's activism and how it's just used incredibly creative strategies, I would say, like Disabled People Against the Cuts, for example, to represent the complexity of suicide, but to also try to find ways to recognise government culpability in the ways that suicide is represented. So first, what I want to take us to look at then is the way that trajectories of causality are mobilised in some of these newspaper articles. So let me just find this on this. Here we go. So out of the 30 articles about suicide, which is a fraction in comparison to the amount of actual suicides there have been, so it shows you how kind of scant the coverage is, from 2009 to 2014, 26 of them make an explicit link between austerity measures and suicides. So, for example, they have titles like "Killed by Benefits Cuts." In only 2 of the articles do we hear from the person who actually died by suicide themselves through suicide notes which blame the government. So one really strong example of this, and really distressing example, is the suicide note of Stephanie Bottrell, which has been reproduced by the BBC, is available online through Callan's List. So this sort of public availability of suicide notes is something which comes along with the creation or the public kind of, the entry of austerity suicide, I suppose, into the public imaginary. And so Stephanie left a suicide note to her son, saying she couldn't cope anymore, saying, "Don't blame yourself, it's my life, the only people to blame are the government, no one else." So family are cited in many of the articles and often attribute causality to cuts, as do public letters and accounts from quite a number of UK coroners. For example, Mary Hassel, who is a senior coroner for Inner North London, came to the verdict that a suicide of Michael O'Sullivan, a disabled man who hanged himself, had been a direct result, she said, of being found fit to work. And so that's seen as really significant by a lot of campaigners because it's seen to be the first sort of official and professionalised, I guess, link between work capability assessments and suicide. So worry and anxiety are central in family accounts and suicide notes about how cuts kill. So it would seem that anxious states and nervous conditions constitute the psychic life of austerity for many. In his preface to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, Sartre writes of colonialism's production of a nervous condition that is both political and psychological, for it arises when one's cultural resources have been almost eradicated. Derek Hook's work is also really useful here. So Fanon's Wretched of the Earth documents symptoms of colonialism that include colonial depersonalisation, marked by deep depression, suicidality and persistent insomnia. Using Fanon's psychopolitics, it's colonialism itself that is psychopathological. It's colonialism that is a disease that distorts human relations and renders everyone within it sick, to quote Anya Lumber. There is evidence too then of austerity and global capitalism and neoliberalism more widely making people sick through psychologically and physically wearing them out. Shame in relation to poverty and to austerity, stigma, insecurity, powerlessness have all been named as key austerity ailments that have obviously really damaging psychological impacts. Particularly relevant here, I think, is amongst others, Lauren Ballant's work on slow death as an analytical strategy that describes, to quote Ballant, the physical wearing out of a population and the deterioration of people under contemporary global national regimes of capitalist subordination, and the destruction of bodies by capitalism in spaces of production and in the rest of life. And so taking on Lauren Ballant's work, Jasbir Puar asks what kinds of slow deaths have been ongoing that suicide might represent an escape from. So contextualising suicides within a process of slow death. Rob Nixon's work also, even though it's about environmentalism and something sort of quite different, his ideas around slow violence, even though he doesn't ever quote Ballant, I don't think, but also really contributes to this. And how can we represent those forms of violence which are cumulative and pernicious and potentially quite slow, and that don't fit in our sort of spectacular images of violence sort of privileged by the media. So I think that work could be really useful here. So focusing on worry and anxiety enables a move beyond this sort of solely discursive analysis to explore how austerity is scribed on bodies, embodied and lived. The inscription of worries onto bodies is evident in the death, for example, of Alain Christian, who died from drowning and whose wrists were covered in self-inflicted cuts. Her family said she'd been worrying about a meeting she was due to have to discuss her entitlement to disability benefits. And so from a psychopolitical frame of analysis, Elaine's worry is made flesh as the toxicity of austerity gets under and is marked upon her skin. And for Fanon, that could be read as a process of epidermalisation, where anxiety and inferiority as a product of hierarchies are made flesh and lived through the body. So Elaine's death then seems marked by worry linked to entitlement to benefits, which is itself structured by hierarchies and moral economies of worthiness. Or we could see that as the kind of epidermalisation of stigmatisation. And discursive repertoires in the UK frame entitlements to capacity benefits as an unscrupulous lifestyle choice used to garner public disgust for welfare claimants, and also then public consent for very punitive welfare reforms such as benefit sanctions. And a number of family members quoted within the newspaper articles analysed here actively invoke this kind of scrounger discourse while simultaneously distancing their own family member from that. So they say things like, my brother wasn't a scrounger, he was getting £71.70 a week, he wasn't living on champagne and caviar. Or, you know, despite being employed for months, Martin refused to accept state handouts, he got nothing off the government and was proud not to. He had attempted suicide before because he feared being a burden. And so these kind of hierarchies of worthiness are threaded throughout these articles, of these newspaper articles. And worth here is nearly always conceptualised through quite an economistic framing of productivity, where value is market value, and pretty much only that. And so burden discourse then hinders on much older kind of moral economies which link to early eugenicist formulations of the economic cost of disabled people, and discourses of fitness which are tied to racism, ableism, saneism, etc. And of course to this kind of idea of some bodies as being productive or not. And so mental health problems are mentioned in about half of the newspaper articles that I looked at. And the frameworks evident in the newspaper coverage are not entirely psychocentric. And links between suicide and mental health are seen to occur in quite complex ways. So mental health is mentioned as pre-existing the person's experience of austerity, worsening due to austerity, or as caused by austerity, depending on the article. That's despite the fact that psychocentric framing, as individual psychological factors of suicide, is very much encouraged in guidance, for example, from the World Health Organization, as you talk about, Ian, in your book, around how the media should report suicides, and not that they shouldn't be reported as being understandable within a context. So I'm going to leave that bit there. But where psychocentrism enters the articles is often through the mouthpiece of the Department for Work and Pensions. So loads of the articles cite people from just kind of generic spokesperson responses from the Department for Work and Pensions. And they convey quite a uniform approach to suicide that frames it as tragic, complex and individualised. The Samaritans are also quite often cited, again with a very sort of just, something that's just repeated, almost a stock statement, I suppose. Which says, although a catalyst may appear to be obvious, suicide is seldom the result of a single factor or event and probably has lots of interrelated causes. So such statements then, I think, make a good point, but they also fail to engage with the ways that austerity is lived and felt as a pervasive psychological and bodily anxiety. Despite the numbers of suicides linked to welfare reform, the Department for Work and Pensions claim to keep no record of the circumstances surrounding these deaths, and are quick to point out that the statistics don't point to any causal link, though there have been, and we can talk about this afterwards, a number of internal peer review processes within the DWP around some of these deaths. And so while people's decision to die by suicide might well be really complex, I suppose I'm interested in these articles in the way that the mobilisation of this complexity by the DWP and advice not to contextualise suicide as a coping strategy from the WHO, or a means of escape, say, seems to work to delimit recognition of the complexity of government culpability within austerity suicides. Okay. And so I suppose situating these welfare reform deaths within a psychic texture, if you like, of austerity enables a way of understanding these suicides not as a sudden reaction to a single letter that comes to tell you that your benefits have been stopped, but actually as an act that's embedded within an affective economy of dehumanisation, cumulative effects that, you know, pernicious and continue often for a long time, and that actually work to craft a hostile environment for people who are claiming benefits. And so actually this kind of psychopolitics is far more than conceptual, because I really think it's embodied within the way that disabled people's activism and anti-austerity activism more broadly enacts these creative strategies to try to both show that, of course, suicide is complex, but actually, you know, talking about the years of battles and letters and constant appeals processes and how that wears people down within a context which is already stigmatising them for being unproductive welfare claimants. Okay. So then, in conclusion, I think that we could say that it's not a coincidence that some people that are deemed to be a burden by neoliberal market logic would end their lives. People are killing themselves because they feel potentially the way that the government is telling them that they should feel as a burden, or put another way, we could say that they're killing themselves because austerity is killing them. Austerity suicides may be read then as the sort of ultimate outcome of the internalisation of eugenic and market logic, which underlies a lot of the welfare reform driven by austerity in the UK. And such deaths then, I think, or I wonder if they make visible the slow death that is endemic to austerity and perhaps to neoliberalism more broadly. And so I suppose I'm making the argument that we can only understand those suicides if we take seriously the psychic life and the slow death of austerity against which these suicides are embedded. And I'll stop there. Thank you.